I'm really honoured to be here, and I hope to be provocative in the best sense of the word. Provocative of thought, provocative of questions, and provocative of a will to do something. So in this talk, I'm going to address currently influential arguments about the movement of populations and economic inequalities. Arguments which reproduce forms of political domination, whose origins lie in a European colonialism that often goes unacknowledged. What is most worrying about these arguments, made by analysts who present themselves often as liberal and progressive, at the same time as the arguments they're making legitimize forms of nationalist populism. I will argue in this talk that any effective address of global inequality will require an understanding of the colonial histories that have produced it. Our times are marked by unprecedented attention that's given to the movement of peoples across global divides. This has been highlighted in recent years here in Europe as a consequence of what is generally called the refugee crisis. But I prefer to see it as the crisis produced for refugees by our, that is European, failure to abide by the norms and obligations that have been set out in various international human rights treaties to which we are signatories. For all the attention, media and political, that has been given to this movement of populations, one would imagine that the numbers coming would be far in excess of the 0.31% increase that successful asylum applications have otherwise constituted over the last few years. Even if we were also to add in the numbers of those who come to Europe for what are termed economic reasons, the movement of people in our contemporary times is far smaller and of less significance in terms of its impact on land and other people than earlier movements have been. Here I'm alluding to the mass movement of Europeans to what was coming to be known as the New World across the 19th century, and about which I will say more subsequently. Europe could, but for the most part chooses not to, absorb others into its societies. They, however, were forced to give way to Europeans and to European domination of them. Yet, almost without exception, people writing on migration or addressing issues of global inequality in the present do so without any reference to that earlier movement of Europeans, or how that earlier movement might be a part of the explanation of contemporary inequalities, and as such would need to be taken into account in any solution that might be thought of. Even those commentators on public policy that see migration as the most effective way to address issues of global inequality, such as Branko Milanovic, who was formerly lead researcher in the World Bank, and who has just this week, it was announced, been appointed as Centennial Professor of the International Inequalities Institute at the LSE. What he does is see migration through a presentist lens, which legitimately presents problems for the host society. As such, in an op-ed that he wrote in the Financial Times in 2016, he argued that whilst open borders are likely to be the most effective way of reducing global inequality, this would require a trade-off between citizenship and migration on the part of those moving. In contrast, as I will go on to argue, the post-colonial challenge of our times requires not open borders and restricted citizenship, as conceptualized by Milanovic, but a collective accountability that can only be met through a process of what I call post-colonial reparative action. But first I want to make the argument that's put forward by Milanovic for open borders. Milanovic sees the problems associated with the movement of people resting in two phenomena. First, that globalization has made knowledge of income differentials between countries much better known. Second, that there are real gaps in income between wealthy countries and poorer ones. He argues that whereas previously the locus of global inequality could be identified in class differences, as had been argued by Marx and Engels, it now resides in location. That is, that the poorest citizens in the richest countries have incomes higher than the richest citizens in the poorest countries. It is this income differential across locations that drives people to migrate because, as he argues, people can increase their income several-fold if they migrate from a low mean income location to a high mean income location. Milanovic claims that migration does do more to reduce global poverty and inequality than any other factor, but that the problem with this solution for him is that the arrival of migrants threatens to diminish or dilute the premium enjoyed by citizens of those rich countries, who are then hostile to them arriving. In part, he argues that this is a consequence of those who are the poorest in rich countries being what he calls the biggest losers of globalization. So the shift from the end of the 20th century to the early 21st century saw real incomes rise for nearly everybody globally, except for the poorest 5%. They didn't see their incomes rise, and neither did those who were between the 75th and 90th percentiles of global income distribution. So their income gains were essentially nil, although remember, they're still in the top 25% of income earners globally. And it's these people on lower incomes in rich countries who are presented by Milanovic as being the non-winners of globalization and the people most likely to be threatened by immigration, threatened by it and hostile to it, and he suggests that their hostility has to be acknowledged as legitimate. Milanovic somewhat inconsistently concedes that there's only a slight negative impact on wages as a consequence of migration from poorer countries, which suggests that it's actually domestic policy rather than globalization that's the explanation for the stagnant incomes of the non-winners of the West. In fact, it's the perceived cultural impact of migration that Milanovic treats as significant and requiring accommodation. So there are a number of ways in which he suggests this could be done. One is by restricting migration to workers who come to do specific jobs for a limited amount of time and who would then return to their countries of origin. Another solution would be to restrict the citizenship rights of migrants in the countries of arrival and make them pay higher taxes, given the benefits they gain by getting access to these countries. Excuse me. This, Milanovic argues, would assuage the concerns of the native population while still ensuring that migrants would be better off for moving than they would have been if they'd stayed in their own countries. But notice what Milanovic is actually arguing here. He's arguing that the world's poorest should be asked to pay additional taxation to support those within the 75th and 90th percentile of income globally, while the top 10 percentile appropriates the profit from their exploited labor and have themselves had significant reductions in their tax obligations. So it's the world's poorest who, as a price for their mobility, are being asked to pay taxes for services for others to which they are denied access, as well as a further tax for simply working in wealthier countries. This, Milanovic suggests, is a compromise solution, and it's a compromise solution which is in tune with globalization, but also with what he calls the legitimate concerns of national heritage, and I'll come back to this again later. As I will go on to argue, this compromise solution is only a solution in the context of accepting neoliberal norms and precepts as defining not just our contemporary times, but our normative understandings. The idea that issues of global inequality can be addressed through the movement of individuals across open borders, in conjunction with limiting the rights of those who move, has been put forward by a number of influential economists and other scholars working within global public policy. Two such are Eric Posner and Glenn Whale, a lawyer and an economist, who have put forward arguments to the World Bank for a system of open migration laws coupled with a caste system. They suggest that we look to the Gulf states, which, by welcoming migrant workers, they argue, do more than any rich country to alleviate or to reduce global inequality. Now, they recognize that migration to these countries is facilitated by limiting the rights of the people who move and call the states authoritarian, But they suggest that reducing, and here I quote, reducing inequality will require uncomfortable trade-offs. Indeed, they state quite openly that Gulf states explicitly seek non-Arab dark-skinned migrants in order to minimize the risk that nationals will sympathize, fraternize, or intermarry with migrants who might then demand permanent residence, if not citizenship. And again, they argue that whilst the exploitation of endangered labour is to the benefit of the employers and consumers, they also argue that it's to the benefit of the indentured labourers who are escaping worse conditions at home. This, as I've argued with John Homewood elsewhere, is a pro-slavery argument for the free movement of unfree labour. Significantly, they repeat arguments last articulated in defence of Jim Crow policies in the southern states of the United States. Specifically, that slavery itself was relatively beneficial, and this is an argument that Glenn Whale has made, was relatively beneficial for transported Africans compared with the circumstances in Africa from which they came. Belonging, and with it, the right to have social and political rights, is presented as a privilege of local European and European-descended citizens. Poor migrants are displaced from where they belong and are to be offered no recognition or rights in the places to which they move. This is exacerbated by Posner and Whale's further proposal for relatively disadvantaged citizens in wealthy countries to be able to sponsor or rent migrants. The chapter in their book is called Rent a Migrant, as a way of binding them into, and these are left-wing economists, by the way, or they see themselves as left-wing economists. So they put forward an argument for renting a migrant as a way of binding disadvantaged citizens in wealthy countries into the overarching project of alleviating global poverty by providing them with a direct return. So they recognize that enforcing cheap labor creates a windfall profit for those who can access it, and they seek to resolve that inequality by widening the pool of exploiters. Domestic capital should be free to exploit indentured labour via a segregated system dependent on patronage and enforced through the maintenance of ascribed differences. So, not so much a universal basic income as a racialised income supplement. Such arguments depend on the idea that the global north bears no collective responsibility for the conditions found in the global south. The issues are framed simply in terms of charity, of our charity and benevolence towards others in constrained circumstances, with little reflection on how we might be responsible for the commission and maintenance of those very circumstances. As Chris Bertram argues, such a posited solution, and I quote, distorts our moral understanding, specifically our understanding of justice, to represent a pragmatic compromise with unjust attitudes as exemplifying what justice itself demands. Denying rights to alleviate global inequality, he continues, when we could achieve the same outcome by acting otherwise, involves the active commission of injustice. Global inequality, I suggest, is not a natural condition that requires us to address it through acts of willed generosity, but rather it requires a more thoroughgoing understanding of its production and our related obligations as a consequence of our shared and unequal histories. So there's a general recognition within Milanovic and the others that the process of moving as a means of addressing issues of local impoverishment and inequality is not new. They recognize that people have always moved to address issues of inequality. And yet there's little discussion of how earlier movements, which were also known as emigrationist colonialism, are themselves part of the process of creating the vast differentials between incomes globally. So today, European and North American scholars and debates very rarely refer to colonialism and barely to that movement of people, for the most part poor Europeans, who, whether intentionally or not, come to be part of the project of settler colonialism. And the part of the projects of the processes of dispossession, elimination, and extraction that have significantly contributed to the specific configuration of contemporary inequalities. So across the 19th century, over 60 million Europeans left their countries of origin to make new lives and livelihoods on lands inhabited by others. At least 7 million Germans moved to these lands, to the United States in the north and to Brazil and Argentina in the south. Large-scale Polish emigration started in the period after the Franco-Prussian War, and by the turn to the 20th century, over 2 million Polish people had moved to the Americas. 2 million subjects of the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary also travelled there, as did over 8 million Irish people, including 1 million as a consequence of the mid-century famine induced by British colonial rule. So by 1890, nearly 1 million Swedes, 1/5 of the total population, were living in the US. And 13.5 million British people had moved to white settler colonies across the globe. This movement of people of such magnitude is implicitly claimed to be unproblematic. And in some of the literature, it is called the age of free migration. So it's called the age of free migration, referring to the open border of the United States during most of this period. This appears to suggest that the mass European movement of the 19th century occurred without any contestation. What is not accounted for in such a presentation is the preceding movement, also of Europeans, that had largely eliminated the prior populations of these lands to enable them to be seen as free soil. The open border of the United States was only open as a consequence of Europeans having eliminated indigenous peoples and appropriated their lands. It was not open prior to being made so through European colonization. As such, not only are European imperial powers implicated in the production of global inequalities, but also broader European populations who, by moving to these lands, consolidated the manifest destiny of expansion at the expense of the prior inhabitants. These movements are different to contemporary migration, not least because those who move across borders in the present live according to the rules and norms of the societies of the lands to which they come. This was not the case with Europeans moving to the lands of others. Those who moved in the age of free migration are better understood as colonial settlers, and colonial settlers are not migrants, even if much of the scholarship describes them as such. To naturalize the historical processes of conquest and colonization as migration normalizes and legitimates violence in the past as the condition for continued violence against others in the present. That is, that the violence of imperial rule and colonial settlement disappears from histories of the nation, happening as it does ostensibly outside of the borders of the national state. At the same time as arguments about national sovereignty and national heritage are used to securitize borders in the present and to argue for differentiated citizenship for those with the temerity to move across them. Milanovic and others argue for the legitimacy of concerns associated with questions of national heritage and perceive problems of the integration of difference, and yet it is colonialism that racialized difference and made it difficult to consider treating diverse others as equals. On this, there is little to no comment. So this form of methodological nationalism, or methodological whiteness as I've called it, within the social sciences, whilst it leads to inadequate scholarship in its own terms, it also has pernicious consequences in the debates on migration and citizenship. The reason that many scholars argue that poor migrants should not have access to full citizenship rights is because they believe that this would be unfair to local citizens whose citizenship premium would be diminished. This is because, as Milanovic states, rich countries accumulate wealth and transmit it, along with many other advantages, to the next generation of their citizens. We take it as normal, he suggests, and I quote, that there is a transmission of collectively acquired wealth over generations within the same nation and for the enjoyment of its national citizens. But if, as I've argued at length elsewhere, European states were not constituted simply as nations, but as imperial powers, and a significant proportion of what is presented as their national wealth historically is attributable to the coerced labour and appropriated resources of others, then what does it mean to argue for the protection of that wealth for one's own citizens? The idea that most European countries were simply nations generating wealth endogenously is a fundamental misreading of history. Even those countries that were not explicitly regarded as being colonial powers nonetheless partook of the wealth of the European colonial project through the involvement of their populations in emigrationist colonialism and through being the beneficiaries of what the economist Utsa Patnaik has called colonial drain. Indigenous peoples in Abeyala or Turtle Island, lands that today we call the Americas, were eliminated and dispossessed by European invaders who claimed their land and resources in the name of European states. Africans were stolen from their land and forcibly transported across the ocean to be coerced to labour on plantations in the New World. The wealth and resources of India were drained primarily by British traders and then the British government to the tune of $45 trillion to the benefit of the mother country and her settler offshoots. After the abolition of slavery, millions of Indian and Chinese labourers were taken to work on the very same plantations through a system of indenture. African countries depleted of their populations through the European trade in human beings were then colonised for their land and resources. The Belgian king, as an example, appropriated the territory, resources and population of the Congo. He extracted a personal fortune through, among other things, the enforced labour of the population in the rubber industry, which also led to the deaths of millions of people. European colonialism was a collective and individual endeavour that established, determined, and perpetuated the forms of global inequality that continue to disfigure our contemporary world. Its address requires us to acknowledge the ways in which we benefit from this structuring of the world and act to resolve those structures in a social democratic and not a national social democratic way. The injustices which disfigure the world we share in common can only be addressed through acknowledging the histories that have produced them, as well as the historiographies that have obscured them. This requires reflection upon that past and what I have called post-colonial reparative action in the present. Perhaps unconditionally accepting refugees, asylum seekers, and other migrants to Europe would mitigate the actions of earlier generations that have precisely made the places they come from unlivable. Could rethinking and reformulating trade and other policies, which are entirely to Europe's and the West's advantage, be an act of reparative justice? Might relabeling aid as reparations create the space for conversations about how little Europe gives and how much of what is given returns anyway to Europe, and facilitate the possibility of doing more? Europe is the wealthiest continent on the planet. Its wealth is an inheritance that derives from the very same historical processes that have left other places in poverty. The only effective solution to issues of global inequality is to acknowledge and address these histories through forms of collective global redistributive justice. Thank you.